Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do a video doing tips and tricks for how to make miniature polymer clay, sculpey food for your dollhouse, because I've been doing this for a pretty long time now, several years, and I thought I might have some hacks for people to try if they're willing to start learning or if they want to improve the food that they're making. So let's get into it. Tip number one. Use transparent clay. Technically, it's not really transparent clay, it's more opaque, but it looks like this, and you're going to want to include it in all your food. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be butter, it can be fruit, it can be bread, cake, anything. Because if you look at all the food that you see, it's not entirely solid, it's not entirely matte, and that's what makes food look the way it does. So how you use it is you just mix it together into the clay color that you're planning on using, and once it's hardened, you won't notice an enormous difference, but it does really make a difference. The next tip is to use liquid clay for icing and frosting. As you can see on the multiple cakes I've made, I have a small obsession. I really use a lot of frosting and icing elements, and I think it looks really cool and really adds to the finished product. An extra tip for this is not to mix your frosting like inside of a container or anything, because it doesn't air dry and it's really hard to clean out. So what I do is I just take a post-it note and I mix it together on the post-it note. And the fun thing about this is that you can throw the post-it note away when you're done. Just fold it in half and chuck it in the trash can. So how you use it to make frosting is you just squirt a little bit of it onto the work surface that you're going to use, like a post-it note. Take the clay and drop little pinches at a time, and then use some kind of flat tool. Could be a knife, could be a tool like I'm using, and you just kind of smush it and swirl it around until it all mixes together. You can also use this for icing. For cookies and things. I have to show you these cookies because I'm so proud of them. These are very simple. You just use almost the same principle, only it's actually a little bit easier. Squirt a little bit of it out onto the work surface and just add some powder pastel to it to add the desired color. Learned that tip off of YouTube and it has served me well. The next tip is concerning cutting your creations. If you want a cake or a loaf of bread into slices, what you're going to want to do is, if you're going to cut it after baking, which is recommended because it doesn't make it lose its shape, then you can use either an X-Acto or some kind of non-serrated knife, preferably with, the thinnest blade you can find. But you want to use it directly after baking while it's still hot. It really gives it this nice, smooth, defined finish that really does look a lot like cut bread, in my opinion. But if you wait too long after baking, then it will cool off and it will break rather than cut, so fair warning there. If you need to cut it before baking, I would not recommend using a knife in most cases, unless, for example, you need to take a slice out of a cake or something. What you're going to want to do before baking is use either thread or dental floss. You're just going to want to wrap it around your hands or your fingers and cut directly down, very smooth, very even, and it will cut through it very cleanly and will not leave indentations and stretch out of shape the way a knife normally would. To add some extra color pop, use pastels. If you have pastels already in powder form, that would be a lot better, but I don't have anything like that. I just use a piece of paper or, again, a post-it note and just kind of scribble it on there until I have some powder, and then use a brush to transfer it onto the clay. But a quick tip for this, you're going to want to go from the lightest color you need to the darkest color you need. Never start with the darker color, or it's not going to have the effect you're looking for. So just go by an image and use the lightest color of shading you need to the darkest color, exclusively in that order. Never go off that. See, it just really adds a lot to the bottom of this cake. Makes it look so delicious and yummy and just, barely browned, and to this little apple, it adds a nice rosy look. It adds an extra layer that you can't get if you just have, your solid color item. Alright, next tip is to remember scale. Scale is very important in making dollhouse stuff, because otherwise you're going to have some really big items, some really small items. Things just will not look consistent the way you want them to. You just have to basically keep in mind how big things are in real life. For example, a normal round cake is 9 inches, a normal cake pan is 9 inches, which is 3/4 of a foot. And if you're doing 1/12 scale, that means 1 inch equals 1 foot for them. So 3/4 of a foot is 3/4 of an inch, which is 3/4. Next tip, texture. Texture is another thing that really adds an extra layer of realness to mini food. Like, I mean, I made this turkey from a YouTube tutorial and there is so much texture all over the surface and it makes it look so real, so much like an actual turkey. I'm so pleased. This is one of my favorite food miniatures. And what you can use for textures, I have some of these tools that have textured rods on the end, but if those aren't available to you, you can use a toothbrush, you can ball up a piece of tissue paper or tin foil depending on how strong you want the ridges and pockmarks to be, and just roll that across the surface of your mini. There are many ways to get texture, and like I said, texture really adds an extra layer of realness to the mini food. I forgot to add texture to the underside of these cookies before I baked them. And they still look great, but they would have looked even better with some texturing and some pastels. Next tip concerns pre-baking. If you don't know what pre-baking is, it's just another word for baking, just before the item's done. Because on some items, you're gonna have multiple layers of stuff. Like on a cake, you're gonna have the cake and the frosting and any toppings you're gonna add on that. And the more layers you add, the more likely you are to mess up the layers that came before as you add. If, for example, you make the cake first and then after you've baked, you add the frosting and the toppings, then you're less likely to mess up the cake itself. So pre-baking is very important, and you gotta bear in mind that you need to have the thing completely finished. You have to be certain that this is the way you want it before you pre-bake and continue. All right, next tip, use reference images. This is actually a pretty important thing to me in any area of art, in drawing, in painting, in minis. It's very helpful to have a reference image so that you make sure you're doing it correctly and you're depicting it accurately, because otherwise you can make some kind of horrible mistake and realize it way later and you're gonna wish that you had known that was there before you baked. So for these are three of my most favoriteest miniatures. I think they turned out so well, and that's partially because I used reference images for all three of them. Like I said, the turkey was a YouTube tutorial, and most of the cakes I made by using reference images off of the internet to make sure the icing was falling in the right places, etc., etc. Reference images are enormously helpful. All right, next tip, when you make the base of something that's eventually going to be shaded with pastels, you don't want to make the base be the color that you want it to be when it's done. That's what the shading is for. What you want to do is look at your reference image and find the lightest color, like the color the inside of the apple would be, or the color the cake would have been before you baked it, or whatever. And you're going to want to probably mix this color from the colors of clay you already have. You're going to see very few things in the real world that are solid crayon orange or solid crayon brown or anything, unless you're making like a chocolate bar or something. You're not likely to use the direct colors, so you're going to want to mix your own unique colors. Okay, last tip, glazing. I know some people add like matte glaze to the outside of whatever they just finished in order to seal it in, but I really don't do that because I don't find really that it really helps seal in the colors or anything for me, especially since I haven't found a matte glaze that's actually matte. So I don't normally glaze my miniatures and seal them in unless it's something that adds to the look of it. I sealed in the chocolate cake and the turkey because that was the finish for both of them. I wanted the chocolate cake to have a little bit of luster, and the turkey needed to have an actual like food glaze on the outside type look. And on this little biscuit, I glazed the butter in order to make it look like it was kind of melting, you know, make it look really delicious and inviting. So unless I really need it for the look of the miniature, I don't normally glaze. Well, that is all the tips and tricks I have for today. Make sure to check out the other miniatures, tutorials, tips, whatever I have. Drop me a hello in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!